Benvenuti a Il piacere della lettura, il podcast di quotidiano nazionale dedicato ai libri, agli scrittori, alle scrittrici e alle storie. Oggi con noi Frank Furedi. Benvenuto. Il libro di cui parleremo oggi è La guerra contro il passato, edito da Fazi. La guerra contro il passato è un saggio che denuncia come la nostra epoca stia sviluppando una vera e propria ostilità verso la storia. Lei parla di guerra contro il passato, non solo in senso metaforico. Oltre a statue e libri, quali atti concreti giustificano davvero il termine, la parola guerra?
Well, it's a war in the sense that every dimension of the past is called into question. So it's the knowledge of the past, it's the values of the past, it's to do with the way that the people in the past have lived are criticized, but they're not just criticized in a objective way. What people are saying is that these people 1,000 years ago not only knew less than we did, which is true, but they also say that they weren't as good people as we are. So you regard people in the past as your moral inferiors. But it isn't just people or experiences or cultures, even the language of the past is continually questioned. So all the time you say these words we mustn't use anymore, these words are outdated, and there's this relentless, unrestrained attempt to abolish the past altogether. And I think in that sense, it's much more than a metaphor. It's an actual impulse, a very powerful impulse, which leads to the invasion of the past by people living in the present.
Orwell ha scritto in 1984: chi controlla il passato controlla il futuro, chi controlla il presente controlla il passato. Che cosa pensa di questa citazione?
Well, Orwell is very interesting because for some reason he had certain insights, mainly because he lived in an era where there was an attempt by the totalitarian nations to capture the language, and not only capture the language, but also to rewrite history, to rewrite the past in such a way that it becomes almost unrecognizable. And one of the things that Orwell sensitizes to is that sometimes there's an attempt to abolish the temporal distinction between the past and the present and the future. And I think we're living in a moment where increasingly we live in a world where the distinction between the past and the present is gone. And because the distinction between the past and the present is undermined, we also have no way of understanding what the future will be. So there he's wrong, because we've given up on controlling the future because we're so obsessed with the past that we no longer believe that there is a future. So this is the first time in the modern era where there is no political parties, there's no political ideologies that are future-oriented. I mean, can you name me one party in Europe that says we can build a better future, that it will be a much better future than before? They don't exist. And I think that's something that even Orwell could not have imagined.
L'episodio della statua di Lincoln a Portland è l'innesco del libro. Che cosa le ha fatto capire che non era un caso isolato, ma il culmine di una tendenza?
I don't know. Sometimes, you get this intuitive feeling that something has gone wrong, and you can't really explain to yourself what it is. And maybe it's because when I was a young boy, Lincoln was one of my heroes, and I thought it was great that he played that positive, progressive role of liberating slavery. And maybe because I've seen other statues being just routinely torn down, or maybe because I was meeting a lot of people who were very dismissive of the past. They were very callous, and they just said, this is the past, forget about it, that's done. We're different kind of people. But I think that's a kind of a catalyzing moment, because Portland didn't just have the statue torn down. Portland was turned into this almost like a very primitive sort of city where crime was flourishing, where people were behaving very badly, where you had this group called Antifa that was going around and just basically speaking a language which is anti-civilizational. And to me, this looked like a nightmare movie, a horror movie. And I think that's what it was. It was almost like watching this unfold. It was like going to a cinema and coming away with a very, very bad feeling. And I said to myself, okay, I got something else I want to do, but I have to write this book. Well, I feel so passionate about it.
A proposito di statue, in Italia, come sa, abbiamo avuto il fascismo, le cui ideologie oggi sono vietate dalla Costituzione. Mussolini è stato alleato di Hitler, ha promulgato le leggi razziali, eccetera. Secondo lei, quindi, sarebbe sbagliato comunque distruggere il busto di Mussolini perché considerato ormai personaggio storico? Sarebbe cancel culture?
I think there's a difference between pulling down a statue in context. So, for example, when I was a child in Hungary, in the Hungarian Revolution, I remember people pulling down the statues of Stalin, and everybody was really happy and smiling and everything else, because that was a revolution that was happening all the time, and it was a way of kicking back against the system, and I think that was perfectly all right. I think there's a difference between that and then when you basically decide that everything from the past is put to question. So if you take the case of Mussolini, it's very interesting because I'm not really sure what the right answer is. I know that sometimes I go to Dongo, which is, there's a Mussolini museum there. And in front of the museum there is the fascist, the pro-fascist and the anti-fascist. And it's evident that the experience of Mussolini, that legacy still has an impact on all sides of the political divide. I think that my first instinct is to say, keep the statues. My second instinct is that maybe what you can do is what happened in Hungary, where you took all the communist statues down and you put them in a park. So there's a big park outside of Budapest where you have statues of Lenin and Stalin and everybody else. And maybe that's a solution where you say, okay, well, we don't want Mussolini's bust in the middle of the town. We'll put that in this particular place. But I haven't got any strong views about it. My first instinct is never to take a statue down, but you can write, Mussolini was a fascist, he passed some very bad laws, he did some very bad things, and people will learn that way.
Lei parla di archeologia di rimostranza. Può dirci che cosa significa e può essere che esiste questa archeologia della rimostranza perché fino ad oggi si è sempre detto non potete fare questo perché si è sempre fatto così e quindi è nata per questo motivo l'archeologia della rimostranza?
Yeah, people have always said that it's always been like this. And of course we know that's not really true. And I can understand why people want to look at the past critically, because not everything that happened in the past is beautiful. There are some very bad things that have occurred. But the archaeology of grievance isn't a mature reaction against this. I think the archaeology of grievance is a very immature process whereby people are trying to give meaning to their identity that they cannot do from their lives. So what people say, for example, that somebody like Cleopatra must have been a lesbian because she's a strong woman, and therefore LGBTQ culture validates itself by looking at historical figures. Or alternatively, what you do is you say, well, Greek democracy wasn't really good. No point idealizing it because the Greeks had slaves. But that forgets the fact that everybody had slaves in those days, and it doesn't diminish the importance of democracy, of an idea of equality beginning to emerge a long time ago. So I think that what grievance archaeology does, it continually looks for bad things in the past. Or alternatively, it continues to say that we weren't appreciated, our voice was not heard. Joan of Arc was a trans woman, and yet trans culture wasn't recognized. So it's a very cynical way of using the past to plunder the past, to make it into a resource to validate yourself here in the present. And I think what I dislike about grievance archaeology is you're continually turning the past into this kind of hunting ground where you basically feel that you can use these individuals from the past to morally put them down in order to make yourself look really, really good. And I think that's a tragic development that people feel that they cannot really live in the present. They have to find a good excuse in the past to justify themselves.
Lei dice che il presentismo sbarra anche la strada al futuro. Che tipo di politiche culturali o educative proporrebbe per riaprire quell'orizzonte?
It's not an easy question to answer, but I tend to think that what's really important is to follow the words of the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who basically argues that what we need is an educational process that on the one hand conserves the past, but you conserve the past not to just simply say, oh, it's really brilliant, it's really good, but as a way of creating a foundation from which you can then move on and develop and experiment. So basically what we need in our culture is a synthesis of a powerful conservative impulse towards the legacy of the past and an exciting, experimentative, open-ended orientation towards the future. I know it sounds difficult to accomplish that, but there were historical moments. I think, for example, in Italy, the Renaissance was a very good moment where, on the one hand, you took seriously the wisdom of the ancients, but you didn't just stop with the wisdom of the ancients. You had this incredible flourishing of Italian culture, sort of which the whole of Europe still benefits from now. I mean, without Dante, I don't know what happens in European culture when you look at all the incredible things that were happening. But that kind of synthesis is what we need. And in a sense, what we need in the West is a kind of cultural revolution where you basically revolt against the present-day cultural norms, which are extremely anti-civilizational. And we try to create a kind of culture that basically appreciates the best of the past, but is extremely fixed on committing society towards being open-minded about the possibilities of the here and now.
Lei parla di tradimento culturale dei governi che non difendono il patrimonio storico. Di quali omissioni concrete li ritiene responsabili e quale sarebbe il reale motivo per cui la politica non interverrebbe?
So the way that I look at it is that the elites in our society are no longer the kind of elites that are capable of transmitting the wisdom of the past. And it's not that they're bad people. It's just that there's no longer a noblesse oblige within the elite class where there's something that bands them together. And they say that, we are Italy. And our job as the elites of Italy is not to enjoy being elites, but our job is to take responsibility and have the duty to make sure that young people in Italian society is aware of where they kind of come from. And they're not capable of doing that. And I think that's the same everywhere in Western Europe and the United States, Canada, where there's a kind of what I call psychic distancing from the values and the traditions into which their parents and their grandparents were socialized into. And if you look around, there's, I look at the elites in Europe as consumers. They're always consuming different values. They're looking for new big ideas. How many times have I heard politicians talk about, let's find a big idea, let's think outside of the box. It's almost like they're fishing and they're hoping that they're going to come up with something, when all the time there's a lot of ideas that they could, in a sense, internalize and make their own. So the problem is not simply political, it's cultural, because these people, they might be very nice, lovely people, lovely husbands and wives and all the rest of that, but they have not taken responsibility for their privileged position, and they have an incapacity to take seriously that they have a very important duty to make sure that the people that they represent are somehow educated, socialized, and most important of all, inspired, really inspired about the world that they've come from. And in that way, they will have the roots to give them the confidence to kind of face the future.
In conclusione, lei propone un rapporto più ricco di sfumature con il passato. Se avesse 3 azioni prioritarie da implementare domani, scuola, media, musei, quali sarebbero?
Trick question. I think that the number one thing I would do is to change the school curriculum so that children at least do one subject that connects them organically to where they kind of come from. And that could be history, that could be philosophy, that could be theology, even anthropology, something that connects them to where they come from. So they're able to appreciate that they have some roots in the world that they live in. I think that's the first important thing that I would do. The second important thing I would do, I say this as a university professor, is to challenge the regime of conformism in the universities. It's terribly conform. Italy is very bad like this. I mean, so is England, but there's a kind of narrow-minded sort of culture where you have to, unless you say what's expected of you to say, then you're in trouble. And it's very difficult to get advanced and make your way. I think the universities need to be shaken up, and isn't just simply cancel culture, that's bad enough. But we need more academic freedom to be able to allow more voices to to kind of pursue intellectual endeavors so that it's just becomes a little bit more exciting. You have no idea how boring universities have become. And that's, to me, is a tragedy. Having spent 40 years of my life in a university, that's my personal tragedy. The third thing that I would do, which is really quite important, is somehow, and it's the most difficult question of all, somehow get people to understand the importance of community. I've got a Substack, and my Substack is called Roots and Wings. And it comes from Goethe's, the German poet Goethe. Right? He basically says, there's two things we can give to our children that's incredibly important. One is roots, so that they have roots, they know where they're based on. And the other one is wings, so then they can fly. Because you cannot fly unless you have roots. This is something that our culture doesn't really understand. And same thing with a community. We need communities that people respect and they want to be part of. But of course, if it's a strong community, then we can all fly away. And we might come back and we might not come back. But that is, to me, the essence of a civilized culture, a democratic culture that we got to build towards. So those would be my three things. I can think of many more, but I think the education thing is the most important.
Oggi al piacere della lettura abbiamo parlato della guerra contro il passato, edito da Fazi. E lei, Frank, quale libro ci consiglierebbe per il piacere della lettura?
So the book that I suggest is by Christopher Lasch. It's called Revolt of the Elites. And I've got this thing where I'm a little bit like Machiavelli. You know, Machiavelli, when he was writing, he talks about how in the evenings he would sit in the garden, dressed up like an ancient, and have a conversation with